freezing. So cold all of a sudden. Must be my imagination.
Okay, so I'm a little bit late to the party with this review, but given that my excitement for this game was the reason I kickstarted this whole YouTube thing in the first place, I wanted to take the time to really digest it. When I replayed the original Resident Evil 4 recently for my first video, I was surprised at how well it seemed to hold up against modern standards. Within seconds of starting the remake though, I realised that this wasn't really true, and I appreciated how badly an upgrade was needed. Right from the start, it's obvious how aesthetically impressive this remake is. After an expanded opening sequence where suspense is built effectively by having you go after one of the police officers, you realise that fundamentally this is still very much Resident Evil 4 from 2005. And by that I mean, this isn't a radically different style like in Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes. The camera angle, environments, even the way Leon looks and moves is recognisable. But this very much feels like Resident Evil 4 as it should always have been, with one of the biggest advantages aside from fresh visuals being freedom of movement and evolved combat mechanics. But before we get to that, I'm a big fan of games that immediately immerse you into their worlds, and here I love the subtle realism in the way that Leon moves and interacts with his surroundings. The environments themselves look stunning, with many of them actually forcing me to stop for a few moments just to absorb the atmosphere before moving on. I didn't run through most sections of this game, I walked through them, and that's testament to the love and attention to detail that Capcom have put into faithfully recreating familiar areas, still making them feel fresh and surprising. Another thing I noticed as I went through the game was that where the original was kinda goofy at times and self-aware, not taking itself too seriously, the remake does have occasional light-hearted moments, but overall it feels like much more of a dark, mature and gritty experience, really coming into its own when the darkness descends and the rain starts falling. Okay, so creating the remake was justified and it looks great, but lots of games look great these days. What is it actually like to play? Is it really that much of an improvement over the original? Let's take a look, and at the end of the video I'll reveal where this game sits in my overall ranking of the series for anyone who asked in the comments of my first video. FYI, this review does contain minor spoilers for the remake of Resident Evil 4. So beneath the impressive presentation, let's expand on probably the most obvious advantage for the remake, which is Leon's new freedom of movement. In gameplay, this immediately gives combat the fluidity and pacing that it really needed. Being stationary in the original game led to some tense moments, but that was never really going to cut it here, and the developers have used inspiration from their later games to great effect. Fighting or fleeing enemies is intense, satisfying, and carries a real weight to it, especially during chaotic scenes like the one in the village at the beginning, which made me panic with a huge grin on my face. Just like everybody else, I quickly learned that the parry is a vital new move to master early, because enemies hit just as hard as you do, instantly showing that you're going to be up for a well-balanced challenge. And I don't really care about the ridiculousness of parrying chainsaws with a knife. This is still a game, it doesn't need to be realistic to the point of losing useful and fun mechanics like this. And besides, you're not going to feel like a badass for long. I started the game on hardcore but had to restart on standard due to the fact that I just kept getting my ass handed to me. And yeah, I know some people are thinking, well, why don't you just get good, and that's fair enough. But playing on standard is still a decent challenge though, because it requires you to start thinking tactically about how to approach each fight and tip the circumstances in your favour, not just later in the game when tougher enemies show up and you expect to be challenged more. Basic enemies often flank me and sometimes would just seem to pop out of nowhere. I lost count of the amount of times I was grabbed and an enemy held me in place so that another could come along and wallop me in the face with something sharp and spiky. Strategy to ensure that you keep your head and limbs attached to your body often comes from using the environment, which is far more than just set dressing. In the middle of an intense encounter where you become outnumbered, explosive barrels, for example, are very much appreciated and have probably replaced headshots as my new favourite thing. And who doesn't enjoy using a giant chandelier to obliterate a bunch of enemies too? In combat strategy though, guns of course are going to be your main asset, and there's no shortage of ways to combine different types into your arsenal. There are obvious areas where, say, a sniper rifle is definitely going to be better than a shotgun, but variety in environment layout and the abundance of weapons and available upgrades means that players can still pick and choose which they want to suit their playstyle. Personally, I'm a sniper rifle and submachine gun guy, so I put a lot of my money into upgrading clip sizes and adding scopes. I'm a big fan of starter weapons in games as well, so I focused on upgrading the power of my pistols early so that I could rely on them if I ran out of ammo for other guns, or I could unload a few rounds from a more powerful weapon into enemies and then save the rest of the ammo, finishing them off with a couple of pistol shots. This worked a lot of the time, but that being said, there were still plenty of moments where becoming overrun by enemies led to a panic, blindly firing weapons like a total maniac. Using my sniper rifle at close range out of sheer desperation was a hilarious and nerve-wracking experience. Upgrading weapons and switching them out though throughout the game was seamless thanks to a user-friendly menu when chatting with the merchant that was easy to get used to and navigate. The ability to repurchase older weapons at a discount was a great thing and means you can easily experience most guns on offer in a single playthrough. Just like in the original game, melee is also a great way to give yourself some much needed breathing space in combat and get out of sticky situations. A quick shot or two of an enemy's legs will put them down in a pinch, allowing you to boot them away and choose whether to finish them off with a quick knife kill or move on to another approaching enemy. But kicking enemies has its other uses too. Why would you smash barrels yourself when you can just get this guy to do it for you? And I can't be the only one during this scene who has tried opening the trapdoor first and then kicking the guy down it like a game of foot golf. Maybe I am, I won't admit how long I spent trying. Anyway, as you progress further through the game, because this is a remake, a lot of the excitement comes from what lies around the corner because you know what's coming and you can't wait to see how the developers have reimagined and upgraded it. On that note, I mostly like how everything has been recreated here. I've mentioned environments already and how great they look, but these are enhanced by the creepy chanting, whispering and music, and these build on the sinister atmosphere. I especially like the weird sounds that enemies make when they start to go all plagified. I do prefer some of the older versions of enemies though, especially the ones where the plaga comes bursting out of their heads. This just seems so much more gruesome in the original game, the way it kind of came out from the throat area. In the remake I just found the whole tentacle whip thing less impactful, kind of generic almost. I think this is because we've been blessed with high quality graphics, frame rates, etc. for a while now, and after super gory games like Dead Space, Evil Within and Doom, I've just become kind of desensitized to gore at this point. On that note, I have to mention the boss fight with Mendez as well. This was one of my most anticipated moments in the remake, and it's still spectacular, no doubt about it. I love how he comes stomping out of the flames with his voice suddenly distorted. It was menacing. But in my opinion, nothing will top his transformation from the original game. While we're on the subject of bosses though, fortunately the rest of them throughout the game are all pretty excellent. I enjoyed the knife fight with Krauser, and during the fight with Ramon there was a great homage to one of the funny lines from the original game.
Leave me out of your crappy script.
The final boss battle with Sadler is probably my favourite though. Shooting his many yellow eyeballs is just so satisfying and addictive. The regenerators are also well done in the remake as little mini-bosses, although to be honest I didn't find them nearly as scary as I kinda hoped I would.
Die, you stubborn son of a bitch!
Although the horrible rattle of breath sound that you can hear whenever one of them is about to come slithering out of a vent is also really cool. I really like the puzzle too where you had to use the infrared scope to find the wrench. That was a really cool little trick and I did actually get stuck on that for a while. This brings me nicely onto the subject of puzzles. The abundance of them throughout the game provide another form of thought-provoking entertainment like they did in the original. It's what makes this game such a great blend of action and survival horror. Happily, the puzzles are great this time around. Even though I was kind of familiar with most of them, they actually forced me to engage my brain still with some new twists, rather than say in Resident Evil Village and Resident Evil 7, which are essentially, here's a puzzle, now here's the item, you win. It's not quite like the original Resident Evil trilogy either, where you might find an item that you have no idea what to do with and wander around with it for hours until you've figured it out. Key items in this game are often right near the door or mechanism that you need to unlock. But this is compensated by the fact that the puzzle design itself is clever. You have to overcome visual tricks, memorize patterns, or use trial and error and process of elimination to get through them. Backtracking is also necessary when you locate small keys to open locked drawers and way shrines. And again, this gave me satisfaction because I couldn't open these things right away. I had to progress further into the game and figure it out. Keeping some things a mystery before revealing the solution is a great way to keep the tension building and result in a decent payoff. Distractions from combat though are not just about solving problems, riddles, or enjoying the scenery. Actually exploring the environment serves a purpose, because once again you can find and collect treasures, and these can be set into jewellery and other trinkets to increase their value when selling to the merchant. I don't know why, but there's something so satisfying about being able to examine treasure and different items real close, even the ones you can't pick up and are just there as part of the world. It's something I find myself doing a lot in big open-world RPGs, so I was pleasantly surprised to be doing it here. Hey, I used to have one of those phones. Wasn't pink though, sadly. Downtime also comes in the form of optional challenges again, such as shooting the blue medallions, but these activities have been expanded upon. I don't remember there being quite so many in the original, and this is also a really good improvement to make. The fact that I became obsessed with chasing rats and snakes around is another sign of how engrossed I got into the game. I found myself wanting to try and find every item, complete every optional activity if I could, smash every barrel to find health and ammo, not just because I felt like it, but because I genuinely needed to in order to get through the next fight. That's a sign that survival horror is still alive and well in the Resident Evil universe. I didn't spend as much time in the shooting range as I'm sure most people have, but when you're not chasing small animals around, this was also fun to stop by every now and again to get a bit of target practice in. This time you can earn tokens that unlocks little keyrings that you can attach to your case. This customization was not only satisfying, but the trinkets gave you perks to further help you when you went back into the mire. The case itself was also interesting. Not only can you work towards increasing the size, obviously, but changing the style also gave you perks. Using the red one, for example, would increase the number of red herbs that you come across in the world. And yep, I was just as obsessed with maintaining a tidy inventory as I was in the original game. It's almost a free minigame in itself that further helps pad out the game's runtime. Not that the game needs that. This is a long game by default, with plenty of replay value. It took me around 17 hours on my first playthrough, but it never outstays its welcome.
Okay, it's game time.
The remake comes with new and improved characters that are a delight to watch in cutscenes and give the narrative a new lease of life that is well paced. I think we're all familiar with the story of Resident Evil 4 by this point, but just in case there is anyone watching or listening that is new to the game, you're in a fictional village in Europe searching for the President's daughter, who has been kidnapped by a mysterious cult infected by a nasty parasite that makes the local inhabitants interesting. The story was great in the original, and aside from a few minor tweaks, there's no major differences here that I noticed, only that I did enjoy some of the more poignant scenes between characters and found they had a bigger impact. This is due to the improved dialogue and the actors themselves who bring believable performances to their on-screen counterparts. I'm a big fan of all the recreated characters. I've seen some criticism of Ada, but I wasn't too bothered by her. She's always been dry and sarcastic, and I think the actor pulls it off okay, although I totally get the argument that some lines are delivered just a little bit flat. I do love how she escapes in a helicopter at the end and just leaves Leon and Ashley behind. In fact, while we're on that subject, where the hell is Leon driving that jet ski to? Back to the mainland, I'm guessing, but the fact that he says let's go home and then just goes full throttle into what could be hundreds of miles of open ocean did make me laugh. Anyway, back on topic. In terms of characters, the biggest improvement for me by far is definitely Ashley. She actually feels like a real person that you have to protect this time once you find her. I genuinely panicked whenever she got carried off by the enemy, not just because it would result in a game over, but because she was a likeable character who reacted pretty realistically to the carnage going on around her. I especially loved the little interactions between her and Leon as you're going about your business. The nervous jokes she makes, how she seems genuinely concerned when you're under attack, get injured, or get stuck in every single bear trap in the entire game, like I did. A great example of one of these interactions was in the castle, where Ashley asks if a noise that you can both hear are animals being kept somewhere down in the dungeons. When you get there, Ashley stays behind while you hustle off to investigate, and of course it turns out to be another terrifying thing that wants to turn you into a strawberry slush puppy. Once I defeated it, I went back to find Ashley, and Leon lied to her about what had happened, saying that yep, just a bunch of animals, nothing to worry about. I was keen to test how far these little conversations go, and I actually brought Ashley back to the scene of the fight, and then this happened.
Was this the animal?
No, you can't keep him.
It's attention to detail like this for me that really elevates a game to the next level, because it's another way that the effort that the developers put in really shines through. This brings me nicely to my favourite part of this game, and the biggest improvement over the original, actually playing as Ashley. In my Resident Evil ranking video, I described this section in the original game as too short and not really fulfilling its potential. In the remake, this couldn't be further from the truth. The recreated, reimagined section as Ashley was expanded to terrifying effect and was a great way to mix up gameplay after all that shooting, treasure hunting and so on. I won't spoil what happens just in case anyone hasn't got to this part yet, but the way that the game keeps moving the goalposts once you think you've got the upper hand is really effective.
Which one is it?
Once the section was over and I took control of Leon again, I was hit with a mix of relief but also a pang of regret that it hadn't lasted a little bit longer. This is a perfect example of how to take something that had potential originally and really expanding it to fulfill that potential. I think that's as good a way as any to summarise this entire game, to be fair. So I'm not sure there's really anything else that I can add, only to ask the question, okay, so is the Resident Evil 4 remake a perfect game? Well, almost. My only issues with it are similar to the ones I had with the original. They're nitpicks really, but I did find some of the under siege moments were a little bit too much at times, to the point where some fights tipped towards being frustrating rather than exciting. Yes, you can always change the difficulty, but if you can't change it back again, that's not always something that you want to do. Besides, regardless of what level you play at, I always feel that just piling more enemies at you and then locking the door so you can't escape until you've killed them all is a bit of a cheap way to challenge the player. Fortunately, the game does this naturally too by the variety of enemy designs, so I will let it slide.
This gun turns heads into pumpkins, mate. Take this for a rampage through the patch.
I feel that ultimately though, while this isn't a perfect game, it's the perfect blend of action and survival horror still. The penultimate chapter does lean a little bit too far towards the action side, but I don't mind this at all because the game has earned it at this point. It's right at the end of the game and it's great fun just blasting the shit out of everything and blowing things up. If the whole game had been this, it would be a very different story. Personally, I always prefer the survival horror elements of the Resident Evil franchise, like Resident Evil 2 Remake. But of course that has flaws of its own. Yes, I'm talking about the dreaded cut content, Capcom. Resident Evil 4 Remake though is as faithful as you could have delivered. If I'm being really picky, there are still some things missing, certain bosses or sections like the cable car, but these are minor things that are more than made up for by decent moments like this, which was so fun and reminded me of Crash Bandicoot. For those who watched my first ever video, this game takes the number 2 spot, bettered only by the Resident Evil 1 remake. It is a brilliant game that improves the original in nearly every way, overhauling the graphics and sound, fine-tuning the combat and gameplay, and adding tons of new details and features. Out of 10, this easily takes a 9, and there's only a few little gripes that I have that stop it from being 10 out of 10. So there we go, my first ever review for a single video game is done, and it pretty much agrees with everybody else. No surprises there really, Resident Evil 4 Remake is awesome. I really hope you enjoyed this review though, I hope it brought you some sort of entertainment. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.